The air inside the small sitting room was filled with anticipation. The dim glow of the chandelier reflected off the shimmering blue lace gown worn by Sophia, who stood in the center of the room, radiating confidence. Beside her, Victoria, her mother, fussed over her dress, ensuring every detail was perfect. She adjusted Sophia's jewelry, smoothed her gown, and stole proud glances at the billionaire guest seated before them. In the corner of the room, Isabella sat silently, her presence unnoticed as always. Dressed in a plain Ankara gown, her hair tied back simply, she looked nothing like Sophia, who stood glowing under the warm lights. Isabella was used to being invisible. She had spent years as a servant in the home that was once her father's. Victoria's voice, rich with excitement, broke the silence. "Mr. Ethan, welcome. I'm sure you've heard of my daughter, Sophia. She just graduated from the university. Beautiful, well-mannered, and intelligent." She kept going on about her daughter because she has seen a sleek SUV that he came with Ethan, a powerful and respected billionaire in his mid-40s, sat across from them, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with effortless authority, dressed in a pristine white caftan. His presence commanded attention, yet there was something unexpected in his gaze. A quiet intensity as he observed the room. Then his eyes found Isabella. For a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Isabella quickly lowered her gaze, her heart racing. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. She was never the one who caught anyone's attention. Victoria, still basking in her own assumptions, continued with a light laugh. "You are welcome, sir." She giggled, already imagining the future she had carefully planned. "A man of your status wouldn't visit just any home." Sophia smiled, flipping her long, perfectly styled hair. "I must say I'm flattered," she said, her voice smooth and confident. A silence followed, one so thick it became suffocating. Then Ethan cleared his throat and spoke. "Actually," he said, his tone calm yet firm, "I'm here for her." Victoria's smile faded instantly, her body stiffening. Her gaze snapped toward Isabella, who sat motionless, her hands resting on her lap. "What?" Victoria's voice wavered, a mixture of shock and disbelief. Sophia's confident expression shattered, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. Ethan remained composed. "Yes," he repeated, "I have come to ask for Isabella's hand in marriage." The tray in Isabella's hands slipped, crashing onto the floor. The loud clatter echoed through the room, but it was nothing compared to the storm brewing in Victoria's eyes. "No," Victoria's voice rang out, filled with fury. "This cannot be." Ethan ignored her outburst and turned his attention to Isabella. His voice softened. "Isabella, will you marry me?" All eyes turned to her. Her hands trembled as she tried to process what was happening. It didn't make sense. A man like him, a billionaire, wanted her? Victoria's voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Over my dead body!" Sophia's face twisted in rage, her fingers gripping her gown so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The future she had envisioned, the life of wealth and status, was slipping away before her eyes. Ethan, however, remained unmoved. His deep gaze stayed on Isabella, waiting for an answer. Victoria let out a forced laugh, though anger burned in her eyes. Surely you must be mistaken. You mean Sophia, don't you? She is the perfect wife for a man of your status." But Ethan's response was unwavering. Isabella Victoria's fists clenched. "What do you see in her? She's just a servant. What could she possibly offer you?" Isabella flinched but said nothing. She had heard those words before, time and time again, but this time they hurt more. Ethan's expression softened as he turned to her. "Isabella, do you remember me?" Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Remember you?" she asked, barely finding her voice. He smiled faintly. "You wouldn't. It was years ago. You were just a little girl then, selling oranges by the roadside." A flood of memories rushed back. Selling oranges. standing under the hot sun, barefoot, calling out to passing cars. Ethan continued. One day, you gave an orange to a hungry boy. He was starving, and you gave it to him even though you had very little. Isabella's throat tightened. She did remember. A boy, frail and weak, standing outside the market. She had handed him an orange, and he had looked at her with teary eyes. That boy was me, Ethan said. Gasps filled the room. Victoria staggered backward. Sophia's expression turned to one of sheer disbelief. Ethan smiled. I never forgot that kindness. It was a small act, but it changed me, and now I want to change your life too. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes. Her whole life she had been told she was worthless. But here stood one of the richest men in the country, telling her that she mattered. Victoria snapped, grabbing Sophia's hand and shoving her forward. Sophia is the one you should marry. She is beautiful. She has a degree. Not this. Nobody. Ethan's voice darkened. I am not a fool, madam. I know exactly what kind of person Sophia is. Sophia let out a sharp cry. This is not happening. Victoria turned to Isabella, her face contorted with hatred. You planned this, didn't you? You seduced him behind my back. Isabella's mouth opened in shock. But before she could speak, Victoria's palm struck her across the face. The impact sent Isabella staggering backward, her cheek stinging from the slap. Enough! Ethan's voice boomed through the room. He stepped forward, his presence towering over Victoria. If you ever lay a hand on her again, I will make sure you regret it. Victoria paled, the reality of Ethan's power sinking in. Then, turning back to Isabella, Ethan's voice softened. The choice is yours, Isabella. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Isabella's cheeks. She had spent her life being treated like nothing, and now she was being offered a future beyond anything she had ever imagined. Taking a deep breath, she whispered, Yes. Victoria's body trembled with rage. Sophia looked as if lightning had struck her. Ethan's eyes softened. He stepped closer. You said yes? Isabella swallowed hard and nodded. Yes, I will marry you. The drive to Ethan's mansion was silent. Isabella sat in the plush seat of the luxury car, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart pounded as she stared out of the tinted window, watching the city lights blur past. Was this real? Was she really leaving behind years of suffering? Beside her, Ethan sat calmly, his presence powerful yet comforting. He hadn't said much since they left the house, but his silence wasn't awkward. It was as if he understood she needed time to process everything. After a while, he spoke. Are you okay? Isabella turned to him, her voice shaky. I don't know. A small smile tugged at his lips. I understand. She looked down at her hands, still unable to believe what had happened. I don't have anything, she admitted. No clothes, no shoes, no education like Sophia. What if I embarrass you? Ethan's expression grew serious. Isabella, I didn't choose you for what you have. I chose you for who you are. You have something money cannot buy. A good heart. His words made her throat tighten with emotion. She had spent her entire life being told she was nothing, and now someone was telling her she was enough. The car slowed as they approached a massive golden gate. When it opened, Isabella gasped. The mansion before her looked like something out of a dream, tall and elegant, glowing under the night sky, with grand water fountains lining the driveway. Expensive cars were parked neatly at the entrance. She swallowed hard. This was his world. Did she really belong here? A woman in uniform rushed forward as the driver opened Isabella's door. Welcome, sir, she greeted Ethan with a respectful bow before turning to Isabella with a warm smile. Welcome, madam. Isabella flinched at the title. Madam M. No one had ever called her that before. Ethan must have noticed her hesitation because he leaned in and whispered, You are no longer a maid, Isabella. You are a queen. Her eyes stung with unshed tears. As they walked into the mansion, Isabella struggled to take everything in, The grand staircase, the chandeliers, the golden decorations. It was overwhelming. "This will be your home from now on," Ethan said softly. "You will never suffer again." Before Isabella could respond, a sharp voice rang through the air. "So this is the girl you brought home?" Isabella turned to see a tall, elegant woman standing at the top of the staircase. Her makeup was flawless, her expensive jewelry glittering under the dim lights. But her eyes were ice cold. Ethan's face remained unreadable as he spoke. "Mother." Isabella's stomach dropped. His mother. Margaret slowly descended the stairs, her sharp gaze never leaving Isabella. She folded her arms, assessing her with clear disapproval. This is the girl you chose?" she scoffed, her voice laced with disdain. "You left all the wealthy, educated women in this country and brought home her?" Isabella felt small again, the weight of judgment pressing down on her. Margaret smirked. "Tell me, girl, what exactly qualifies you to be my son's wife?" Isabella opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had faced hatred before, but now she realized she was about to enter an entirely new battle. Isabella stood frozen at the bottom of the grand staircase, her heart pounding as Margaret, Ethan's mother, examined her like a flaw in an otherwise perfect picture. The weight of her judgment pressed down on Isabella's chest, making it hard to breathe. Margaret's smirk deepened. "Tell me, girl, what exactly qualifies you to be my son's wife?" Isabella opened her mouth, but no words came out. What could she say? That she had spent her life scrubbing floors? That she had been treated like a servant in her own home? That she had never even imagined stepping into a world like this? She wasn't like Sophia, who knew how to charm and impress. She wasn't like the elegant women who graced the front pages of magazines. She was just Isabella? Ethan's deep voice broke the silence. "Mother, I didn't bring her here for an interrogation." Margaret let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Interrogation? My dear son, do you think I would allow just anyone to walk into this family?" She turned her sharp gaze back to Isabella. "Do you even know how to behave in high society? Do you know which fork to use at a formal dinner? Do you speak multiple languages? Do you have a degree?" Each question was like a knife to Isabella's chest. She could feel her confidence crumbling. Ethan's grip on her hand tightened. "That's enough, Mother." Margaret sighed dramatically, turning away. "I have warned you, Ethan. If you marry this girl, you will regret it." She walked towards the hallway, but before she disappeared, she added, "And when she embarrasses you, don't say I didn't warn you." Silence filled the mansion. Isabella lowered her head, shame washing over her. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe she wasn't good enough. Ethan gently turned her to face him. "Don't listen to her," he said softly. "You belong here." She bit her lip to stop the tears from spilling. "But she's right. I don't know how to fit into this world. What if I make a fool of myself?" Ethan cupped her face, his eyes filled with something warm, something reassuring. "Then I will teach you. You don't have to be perfect now. You just have to be you." His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace. Just then, a maid approached. "Sir, dinner is ready." Ethan smiled. "Come, let's eat." Isabella hesitated. "Is your mother going to be there?" His smile faded. "Yes, but you are my fiancé, and you have every right to sit at that table." Taking a deep breath, Isabella nodded and followed him to the dining hall. The dining room was unlike anything Isabella had ever seen. The long, polished table gleamed under the light of an enormous chandelier. Expensive silverware was arranged perfectly, and crystal glasses sparkled. At the head of the table sat Margaret, her expression unreadable. Sitting beside her was a woman Isabella had never seen before. She was stunning, flawless dark skin, long braided hair, and a fitted red gown that screamed wealth and power. A smug smile played on her lips as she eyed Isabella. Margaret cleared her throat. "Isabella, meet Juliana, the daughter of Senator Okafor." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. Juliana leaned forward, her smile growing. "Ethan and I have known each other for a very long time," she said sweetly. "I was so surprised when I heard he was engaged." Margaret smirked. "Weren't we all?" Isabella's stomach twisted. She suddenly had a very bad feeling. Juliana lifted her glass of wine. "Well, since we're all here, let's have a toast. To real love." Her eyes met Isabella's, full of challenge. Isabella hesitated, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Margaret smiled. "Juliana and my son have been close since childhood. She has always been part of this family." Juliana tilted her head. "Oh, we go way back, don't we, Ethan?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Juliana!" His voice carried a warning. She laughed lightly, taking a sip of her wine. "Relax. Remember our vacation in Dubai? The yacht parties in Greece?" She turned to Isabella, amusement glinting in her eyes. "Oh, Isabella, you must let us take you one day. Have you ever traveled out of the country?" Isabella swallowed hard. She knew exactly what Juliana was doing, making her feel small. Before she could answer, Margaret sighed dramatically. "I just don't understand, Ethan. You could have had someone like Juliana, and yet you bring home a girl with no class, no background, no manners." Ethan's grip on his fork tightened. "That's enough." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I am simply concerned. You are a man of status. You need a woman who can represent you." Juliana smiled, tilting her head. "Exactly. Marriage isn't just about love, Ethan. It's about power, about legacy. Can she even fit into your world?" Isabella bit her lip. She knew she was different. She wasn't raised in wealth. She didn't know how to hold wine glasses with elegance or make polite conversation about luxury brands and foreign vacations. But she also knew something else. She wasn't going to let them break her. Slowly she lifted her own glass, her hands only slightly shaking. "To real love," she said softly, meeting Juliana's gaze head-on. For a moment the room was silent. Then Ethan smiled, proud. He lifted his glass. "To real love." The power in Isabella's voice must have caught Juliana off guard because her smirk faltered just a little. Margaret, however, was not impressed. She placed her napkin on the table and stood up. "Excuse me, I have lost my appetite." With that, she swept out of the room. Juliana, still holding her glass, murmured, "Don't take it personally, Isabella. You're new to all this." She took a sip, then added, "Let's just hope you can keep up." Something in her voice sent chills down Isabella's spine. She suddenly realized this wasn't just about disapproval. This was a warning. Juliana wasn't just here to intimidate her. She was here to destroy her. The next morning, Isabella woke to the soft sound of birds chirping outside her window. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality settled in. She was no longer in Victoria's house, no longer a servant. As she sat up, there was a knock at the door. A maid entered, bowing slightly. "Good morning, Miss Isabella. Lady Margaret requests your presence for breakfast." Margaret. The knot in Isabella's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to nod. "I'll be there." After freshening up and slipping into a simple yet elegant dress left for her, Isabella made her way downstairs. The breakfast table was just as grand as the dinner table. Margaret sat at the head, her face expressionless. Juliana sat beside her, wearing a knowing smile. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said smoothly, though her tone lacked warmth. "I trust you slept well?" "Yes, ma'am," Isabella replied, keeping her voice polite but firm. Margaret took a sip of her tea before speaking again. "Ethan has gone out for business. In the meantime, I thought it best to get to know you better." Juliana smirked. "Yes, after all, if you're going to be part of this family, you must learn how things work." Isabella met her gaze, sensing the hidden meaning behind those words. Margaret set down her cup. "Tell me, Isabella, do you know anything about hosting a gala, or how to handle business discussions? Have you ever attended a formal event where the most powerful figures in the country are present?" Isabella's hands clenched beneath the table. "No, but I can learn." Margaret tilted her head. "And what about etiquette? Do you know the difference between a dinner fork and a salad fork?" Juliana let out a soft laugh. "Oh, Margaret, be kind. She's new to all of this. We can't expect her to understand overnight." Margaret's lips curled into a smirk. "That's true, which is why I think it would be wise for you to have a guide." Isabella tensed. "A guide?" Juliana leaned forward. "Oh, don't worry, dear. I'd be more than happy to help you adjust." Every part of Isabella knew this wasn't an act of kindness. This was a trap. Margaret smiled. "Juliana has been part of our world for years. She knows how to navigate it. It would be a shame for you to embarrass yourself at upcoming events." Isabella's jaw tightened. They wanted her to fail, but she wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Keeping her voice steady, she met Juliana's gaze. "Thank you for the offer, but I'll learn in my own way." Juliana's smile faltered just slightly, but Margaret's expression darkened. "Oh?" Margaret said, feigning surprise. "Are you saying you don't need help?" Isabella lifted her chin. "I'm saying I will not be molded into what you expect me to be. If Ethan chose me, then I belong here, and I will prove it." Margaret's cold gaze lingered on her, but for the first time a flicker of something else crossed her expression. Acknowledgement. Juliana, however, was not ready to give up so easily. "Well," she said, standing up gracefully, "let's just see how long you last." Isabella's fists tightened beneath the table. Juliana's parting words echoed in Isabella's mind long after breakfast had ended. "Let's just see how long you last." She knew this was only the beginning. Margaret and Juliana weren't just going to disapprove of her, they were going to make her life hell. But she had endured worse. She had survived Victoria and Sophia. She had survived a life of being treated as a servant in her own home. She would survive this too. Taking a deep breath, Isabella pushed back her chair and stood. "Thank you for breakfast," she said politely, keeping her head high as she walked away. Margaret didn't respond. She simply watched her with sharp, assessing eyes. Isabella had no doubt that the real war had only just begun. Later that afternoon, Isabella found herself in one of the mansion's luxurious sitting rooms. She had been sitting there for nearly an hour, flipping through magazines, trying to distract herself from the weight of Margaret's cold treatment and Juliana's silent threats. Then, just as she was about to leave, the door opened. Margaret stepped in, followed by Juliana, both women carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without question. Isabella immediately tensed. This was no coincidence. Margaret walked gracefully toward the couch and sat, crossing her legs. "Isabella," she said smoothly, "let's talk." Isabella turned to fully face her. "About what?" Margaret smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You're going to be the wife of a very powerful man, and yet you know nothing about the world you're stepping into. That needs to change." Juliana smirked, settling into a chair beside her. "Think of this as a lesson in power." Isabella clenched her hands in her lap. "I'm willing to learn," she said evenly. Margaret arched a brow. "Good." She picked up a small bell from the table and rang it once. Within moments, a maid entered, bowing respectfully. "Yes, madam?" Margaret didn't even look at her. "Bring in the invitations." The maid nodded and quickly exited the room. A minute later, she returned with a silver tray stacked with luxurious invitation cards. Margaret picked up the top one, turning it over between her fingers. "The Senator's annual charity ball is this weekend. It's one of the most prestigious events in the country. Politicians, business moguls, celebrities, they will all be there." She placed the invitation down and picked up another. The governor's gala, next month, another. The International Business Summit in 2 weeks. She stacked them neatly in front of Isabella and leaned back. "Do you see where I'm going with this?" Isabella's heart pounded. They were testing her. Juliana leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "Your first event will be the charity ball. I do hope you're prepared." Isabella squared her shoulders. "I'll be ready." Margaret smiled slightly. "We'll see." By evening, Isabella was in her room when a knock sounded at the door. A maid entered, carrying a large box wrapped in a satin ribbon. "This is from Lady Margaret," she said, placing the box on the table before leaving. Isabella hesitated before slowly untying the ribbon and lifting the lid. Inside was a dress, a stunning floor-length ivory satin gown with delicate beading. It was breathtaking, elegant, and 3 sizes too big. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. Margaret was testing her, seeing if she would accept whatever was given to her like a grateful beggar. A fire lit inside Isabella's chest. She would not let them humiliate her. She reached for her phone and dialed a number Ethan had given her earlier, his personal stylist, a woman named Grace. "Hello," came a cheerful voice. "Grace? This is Isabella. I need a favor." The evening of the ball arrived, and the mansion buzzed with activity. Staff rushed around preparing cars, finalizing outfits, and ensuring everything was perfect. Margaret and Juliana were already dressed, both exuding effortless elegance in their custom-made gowns. Juliana smirked as she waited by the grand staircase. "I do hope Isabella didn't have trouble with her dress." Margaret chuckled lightly. "We'll see soon enough." And then Isabella appeared at the top of the staircase. The moment she stepped into view, the entire room fell silent. She wore a stunning, deep red gown perfectly tailored to her frame. The fabric clung to her curves in all the right places, the off-shoulder design adding a touch of timeless elegance. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup flawless. She was breathtaking, regal, powerful. Margaret's lips parted slightly, unable to hide her surprise. Juliana's smirk vanished. Ethan, who had just entered the hall, stopped mid-step, his dark eyes locking onto Isabella. For the first time, Margaret looked at her with something new, acknowledgement. Juliana, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. She quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing. "You clean up well," she said, her voice sweet but sharp. "But let's see how you handle the real test." She stepped closer. "Tell me, Isabella, do you know the protocol for greeting a foreign ambassador? Or how to engage in conversation with a CEO?" Isabella held her gaze, refusing to let her nerves show. "I may not know everything, Juliana." She stepped forward, her confidence unwavering. "But I learn quickly." Margaret's eyes gleamed with interest. Ethan, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Shall we?" He extended his arm to Isabella. Without hesitation, she took it. As they walked past Juliana, Isabella didn't miss the flicker of frustration in her rival's eyes. She had won this round. But the war was far from over. The venue was breathtaking, filled with the most powerful figures in the country. As Isabella entered on Ethan's arm, she felt every single pair of eyes turned to her. The whispers started immediately. "Who is she? Is that Ethan's fiancée? Where did she come from?" Isabella's pulse raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. Then a new voice cut through the whispers. "Well, well, so this is the girl who captured Ethan's heart." Isabella turned and froze. Standing before her was a man with an aura just as powerful as Ethan's, a rival billionaire. And from the way he was looking at her, he had plans of his own. A hush fell over the ballroom as Isabella turned to face the man who had spoken. He stood tall, exuding wealth and confidence, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit. His sharp features and piercing gaze suggested he was used to getting what he wanted. Ethan's grip on Isabella's waist tightened slightly, a subtle but unmistakable sign of territoriality. "Alexander Carter," Ethan said, his tone polite but cold. "Didn't expect to see you here tonight." Alexander smirked. "Ethan, always a pleasure." His eyes flickered toward Isabella, scanning her from head to toe with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "And who is this stunning young lady?" Isabella met his gaze, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. "Isabella," she said firmly. Alexander let out a low chuckle, clearly entertained. "Ah, so you're the woman everyone's been whispering about." He turned his attention back to Ethan. "I must say I'm surprised. You've always been a man of calculated choices." His smirk deepened. "This one seems unexpected." Isabella's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. She knew exactly what he was implying. Ethan's expression darkened. "My choices are my own, Alexander." Alexander nodded, still smirking. Of course, of course." He turned back to Isabella. "I do hope you're prepared for this world, Miss Isabella. It can be quite unforgiving." Isabella refused to look away. "I can handle it." Alexander chuckled again, clearly impressed. "I like her, Ethan. She has spirit." He raised his glass in a mock toast. "I'll be watching." With that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Be careful with him," he murmured in Isabella's ear. "He enjoys playing mind games." Isabella nodded, but deep down, she knew one thing. Alexander wasn't just testing her. He was planning something. The evening continued, filled with introductions, polite conversation, and carefully veiled judgments. Isabella met politicians, CEOs, and socialites, all of whom eyed her with curiosity, some with admiration, others with open skepticism. Margaret and Juliana remained nearby, watching her every move like hawks. Then came the moment Isabella had been dreading, the first dance. The grand orchestra began playing a slow, elegant tune, and Ethan turned to her. "Shall we?" She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. As they stepped onto the dance floor, Isabella could feel every pair of eyes in the ballroom locked onto them. Ethan moved effortlessly, guiding her with practiced ease. She tried to follow, her movements slightly stiff at first, but soon she found the rhythm. "You're doing fine," Ethan whispered, sensing her nervousness. She met his gaze and let out a breath. "I'm just not used to all of this," he smiled. "Then get used to it. You belong here." Just as Isabella was starting to feel comfortable, a new hand suddenly extended toward her. "Mind if I cut in?" Her breath caught as she looked up. Alexander Carter. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I believe she's fine where she is," Alexander smirked. "Come on now, Ethan. It's just a dance." He turned to Isabella, his gaze challenging. "Unless you're afraid." A murmur spread through the ballroom. Juliana, standing at the edge of the dance floor, smirked knowingly. Isabella's pulse quickened. If she refused, it would seem like she was hiding behind Ethan. If she accepted, she would be stepping into dangerous territory. Summoning all her courage, she released Ethan's hand and took Alexander's. Ethan stiffened, his expression unreadable, but he said nothing as Alexander led her into the next dance. The music swelled again, and Isabella found herself in the arms of her fiancé's rival. "You're brave," Alexander murmured as they moved. "I like that." "I'm not here to impress you," she replied. His smirk widened. "No, I imagine you're not. But whether you like it or not, you're in a world where power matters more than anything. And power isn't just about wealth, it's about influence." He leaned in slightly. "Tell me, Isabella, do you know what people are saying about you tonight?" She swallowed hard, but held his gaze. "Let me guess, they think I don't belong here." Alexander chuckled. "You catch on quickly." He spun her effortlessly before pulling her close again. "But I think you already know that, don't you? You don't fit into their world, not yet. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" His words sent a chill down her spine. Alexander wasn't just toying with her. He was challenging her, And deep down, she knew he wasn't wrong. The dance ended, and Alexander released her, stepping back with a satisfied smile. "Well played, Isabella. Let's see how long you last." Before she could respond, Ethan was suddenly beside her, placing a protective hand on her lower back. "Enjoying yourself, Alexander?" Ethan's voice was sharp, his patience thin. Alexander chuckled. "Immensely. Your fiancé is quite the dancer." Ethan's gaze darkened, his grip on Isabella tightening ever so slightly. "Stay away from her." Alexander smirked. "Now, where's the fun in that?" With a final amused glance at Isabella, he walked away. Ethan exhaled sharply, turning to her. "Are you okay?" Isabella nodded, but deep down she felt a storm brewing inside her. She had survived the first test, but Alexander's words still echoed in her mind. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" She wasn't sure yet, but one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The rest of the evening felt like a blur, conversations, fake smiles, whispered judgments, all blending together as Isabella moved through the grand ballroom on Ethan's arm. But no matter how many people she met, how many elegant greetings she attempted, she couldn't shake Alexander's words from her mind. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The truth was, she didn't know. She had stepped into a world where people didn't respect kindness. They respected power, and she had none, for now. By the time they returned to the mansion, Isabella was exhausted. She had barely made it up the grand staircase to her room when she heard a sharp voice behind her. "Wait!" She turned to see Ethan, his expression tense. "We need to talk." Isabella hesitated, then followed him into his study, where he closed the door behind them. The room was dimly lit, the scent of expensive cologne and leather filling the air. Ethan turned to face her, crossing his arms. "What were you thinking?" She frowned. "What do you mean?" He exhaled, his jaw tight. "Dancing with Alexander. Do you have any idea who he is? What he's capable of?" Isabella's hands clenched at her sides. "I know he's your rival, and I know he was testing me. That's exactly why I couldn't back down." Ethan ran a hand through his hair. "You don't understand, Isabella. Alexander doesn't just play games, he destroys people. He sees you as my weakness now. He will use you to get to me." She swallowed hard but lifted her chin. "Then teach me." Ethan blinked. "What?" "Teach me how to handle them," she said, stepping forward. "Your mother, Juliana, Alexander, everyone in this world who's waiting for me to fail. You can protect me all you want, but if I don't learn how to stand on my own, I'll always be a liability." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, finally, he nodded. "All right, you want to learn? Then we start tomorrow." The next morning, Isabella barely had time to eat before Ethan's lessons began. The first lesson? Etiquette. Margaret, surprisingly, was the one to oversee this part of her training, not out of kindness, but out of pride. If Isabella was going to marry her son, she wouldn't allow her to embarrass the family. The first session was brutal. Margaret made her balance books on her head while walking in high heels, critiqued every movement she made at the dining table, and tested her ability to carry on a proper conversation with wealthy socialites. "You eat like a child," Margaret said at one point, sighing in disappointment. Juliana smirked from the corner. "This is painful to watch." Isabella refused to let them see her frustration. She kept going, repeating every movement until she got it right. Margaret didn't say it out loud, but by the end of the day, there was a flicker of approval in her sharp gaze. Lesson 2. Power and Influence. This was Ethan's domain. "You need to learn how to read people," he told her, leading her through his private office, where documents, business deals, and political connections were spread across his desk. "Not just what they say, but what they don't say. Their body language, their motives." He handed her a document. "Tell me what's wrong with this deal." Isabella scanned it, her brows furrowing. "The numbers don't match?" Ethan smirked. "Good. Now tell me why." She hesitated, studying the paper again. Then she saw it. A loophole, hidden in fine print. Her heart pounded. This was deliberate. Ethan nodded. Welcome to the real world, Isabella. After days of training, Isabella was exhausted but sharper than before. So, when Juliana appeared at her door one evening with a fake smile, she knew something was coming. "We're going shopping," Juliana announced, tossing her long braids over her shoulder. Isabella folded her arms. "Shopping?" Juliana nodded. "Yes, you're marrying Ethan. That means the media is watching you now, and we must ensure you look perfect." Isabella narrowed her eyes. "And you suddenly care about how I look?" Juliana smirked. "Not really, but I do enjoy a good show." Isabella sighed. This was a trap, but avoiding it would make her look weak, so she grabbed her purse. "Let's go." The boutique Juliana took her to was one of the most exclusive in the country. Cameras flashed the moment they stepped out of the car, and Isabella realized this wasn't just shopping, this was a staged event. Inside, Juliana wasted no time picking out the most expensive and most revealing dresses. "Oh, try this one," she said sweetly, holding up a gown with a plunging neckline. Isabella sighed. "I'd rather choose my own dress." Juliana shrugged. "Suit yourself." She disappeared into the dressing room, leaving Isabella alone. That's when she overheard the whispers. "That's Ethan's fiancée? She doesn't look like much. Why would he choose her?" Isabella's hands curled into fists. She knew they were waiting for her to react. Instead, she calmly walked to the most elegant dress in the boutique, a sophisticated black gown that exuded power without being flashy. As she changed into it and stepped out, the whispers stopped. Juliana emerged from her own dressing room and froze. Isabella had beaten her at her own game. Later that night, as Isabella returned home, Ethan was waiting for her in the study. He smirked as she walked in. "I saw the photos online. You handled it well," she sighed, kicking off her heels. "Barely." Ethan's expression grew serious. "You're doing better than you think." A warmth spread through Isabella's chest. Then a message popped up on Ethan's phone. He frowned, reading it. "It's from Alexander." Isabella tensed. "What did it say?" Ethan's jaw clenched as he read aloud. "You've trained her well, Ethan. But let's see how she does when she's truly on her own." Isabella's pulse spiked. Alexander wasn't done, and something told her. The real game was about to begin. The days following the shopping incident were filled with rumors. The media had latched onto Isabella's transformation, calling her Ethan's mysterious fiancée. Some admired her, others doubted her. And then came the invitation. A private gala hosted by Alexander Carter himself. Isabella knew this wasn't just a party. This was a challenge. Margaret, surprisingly, had little to say when Isabella told her she would be attending. "You've been trained," she said simply. "Let's see if you've learned anything." Juliana, on the other hand, smirked. "You're walking into the lion's den, dear. I almost feel bad for you." Almost. Ethan wasn't happy about it either. "You don't have to go, Isabella." She met his gaze. "Yes, I do." Ethan exhaled and finally nodded. "Then be careful, and remember everything I've taught you." When Isabella arrived at Alexander's estate, she was met with curious glances and thinly veiled judgment. She ignored them all. Alexander greeted her at the entrance, a knowing smirk on his lips. "Ah, the woman of the hour." She smiled politely. "I assume this isn't just a social event?" Alexander chuckled. "Smart girl." He led her to a private terrace, away from the crowd. The city lights sparkled in the distance, but Isabella wasn't interested in the view. Alexander turned to her, his smirk fading. "You've impressed me, Isabella." She raised a brow. "Should I be flattered?" He let out a low laugh. "Perhaps, but I'll get straight to the point. I have a proposal for you." She stiffened. "I'm listening." Alexander took a slow sip of his drink before speaking. "Leave Ethan." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Isabella's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm. "And why would I do that?" Alexander smiled. "Because if you don't, I will ruin him." Her fingers tightened around her glass. "How?" Alexander leaned in slightly, his voice smooth as silk. "Business is war, Isabella, and Ethan has weaknesses, ones I can exploit," he smirked. "But if you leave him, I'll call off my plans. He'll never even know what was coming." Isabella stared at him, her mind racing. This wasn't just about Juliana's petty games or Margaret's disapproval. This was power, control, war. And she had two choices. One, walk away, let Ethan lose everything, and prove Alexander right, that she was weak. Two, fight back. She chose option two. Isabella smiled. "Alexander, do you know what I've learned these past few weeks?" He raised a brow. "Enlighten me." She took a step closer. "That power isn't just about money, it's about leverage." His smirk faltered just slightly. She continued, her voice smooth. "And do you know what I found out about you?" Alexander's eyes darkened. "What?" Isabella leaned in, lowering her voice. "You have secrets, ones I can use." His expression turned cold. "Careful, Isabella." She smiled sweetly. "Why? Are you afraid?" A tense silence stretched between them. Then, for the first time, Alexander laughed, a deep, amused chuckle. "Ethan really has trained you well," he admitted. "I underestimated you." She tilted her head. "So what now?" Alexander's smirk returned. "Now?" "You've won this round." He extended a hand. "But this isn't over." She shook his hand without hesitation. "I wouldn't expect it to be." And just like that, the game had changed. She wasn't just Ethan's fiancée anymore. She was a player in her own right. When Isabella returned to the mansion that night, Ethan was waiting for her. His expression was tense. "What happened?" She smiled. "I handled it." Ethan studied her carefully. Then, after a long moment, he smiled too. "I never doubted you," he murmured. Margaret, watching from the top of the staircase, remained silent. But Isabella caught something in her gaze. Respect. Juliana, however, wasn't so accepting. "You think this is over?" she hissed later that night. Isabella smiled, completely unfazed. "No, Juliana, but now I know how to win." A week later, Ethan and Isabella stood together at a press conference, where he officially announced their engagement, and no one questioned it. Not Margaret, not Juliana, not the media. Because Isabella had proven herself, she wasn't just Ethan's fiancée, she was his equal. And as she stood beside him, knowing that she had fought for her place in this world, she realized something. She was no longer the girl Victoria had called worthless. She was Isabella Kingston, and she had won.